Today's webinar, blank face there a minute. Fungi of the field and woods. Do you really know who they are? Curtis Young, if you've attended any of our in-person classes, which hopefully this time next year, we'll get back to that. And I see my connection's unstable, so I'll try to take care of that. But Curtis is an extension educator in Ag and Natural Resources in Van Wert County. And as I said, today he's gonna probably lay some really awesome fungi photos in front of us. So enjoy the session. And Curtis, let me stop sharing, and it's all yours.
Okay. And I see it's recording. So all right. So get everything organized here for a second. Get my own pictures out of the way. The subject for today, I'll first say I'm an entomologist by training, but I have adapted to the fungi through photography. And by taking loads of pictures of macrofungi, obviously one of the things I had to do is learn how to identify them appropriately so that I could refer to them in any kind of program that I use them. So yeah, let's see if I can, there we go. Some of the objectives here, we'll look at some of the layman terms used to describe the macrofungi in field guides so that they can be identified in the field. Use common names and scientific names when I remember to do that. Survey some of the diversity that can be encountered right now out in the field. And I was getting a little bit concerned earlier in the season where I was walking through my usual woodlots on a regular basis, and there was hardly anything to be observed. And they really didn't start coming forth until we had the rains at the end of September and the beginning of October, and then they seem to have exploded on the scene. So there was lots and lots of different fungi to be seen. Some of them are edible, or a lot of them are edible, and some of them are poisonous. And that's part of the emphasis of the program here is proper identification so that errors are not made, and we'll come to those points along the way as well. When we start describing the fungi, the macrofungi, what you see in front of you right now is one of the very stereotypic appearances of the macrofungi. This is a standard cap and stem type of mushroom. And you notice over on the side, we have descriptions of these cap and stem types of fungi or mushrooms. Can have gills under the caps. They may have pores under the caps. They may have false gills. And then there's a whole lot of mushrooms that have atypical caps. And we'll look at those very quickly here. And the other thing that we have to remember is we can't always see underneath the cap because as they start growing, they are initially in what would be described as a button stage. And most of the mushrooms that are purchased in grocery stores often are in that button stage when they're young and tender. But as they mature, that cap will flatten out and expose the gills underneath. And these gills are covered initially by a partial veil. And that veil may be thick enough that it remains after the cap opens up and will produce the annulus ring around the stalk, or it may be a very thin partial veil that literally disintegrates as the cap opens up. So that's part of the description of the mushroom as to whether it has that annulus ring left behind as that partial veil is torn open as the cap expands. This stalk, of course, is the stem that holds that cap up into the air. When it comes to describing the gills of a capped mushroom, those gills can be detached from the stem, they can be attached to the stem, they can be decurrent, meaning that they run partway down the stem. And these are all field characteristics that one would look at, as well as are they densely produced under the cap, so densely packed together that you can barely see between the gills? Are they a very wide open distribution of the gills? Do they reach all the way out to the edge of the cap? Are some of them partial gills? Are they smooth along the edge of the gill, or are they rough? So there's a lot of characteristics that are examined when we look at the gills. And of course, the gills of this type of mushroom are where the spores will eventually be generated by that mushroom. And the spores are also a characteristic that we have to look at carefully in terms of identification. What color are they? Are they white, brown, pink, purple? And the list goes on and on as to all the different colors they may be generated as. One way to look at that is to take one of the caps off a mushroom of interest and place it on a piece of paper, actually usually two pieces, a dark sheet and a light sheet, so that the spores can be dropped onto the paper to make a spore print. What sometimes helps in making that spore print would be to place a cup or a bowl over top of the cap so that it doesn't dry out too rapidly while the print is being made. And it only takes several hours in some cases to produce a very nice spore print. And knowing what color the spores are can be very important in that identification. Now, when it gets to some of the trickier mushrooms, all of those characteristics may be almost identical from one species to another closely related species. And the only way to separate those species from one another is to make a microscope slide of those spores and put it under a compound microscope to look at the dimensions of those spores. And the vast majority of people don't have a compound microscope readily available to them. And so that's where we run into some troubled waters at times. If we're that close in the identification of the species, and you have to take that one additional step to really know the difference between one and the other. And that could be very important if one is edible and the other is toxic, to be able to separate the species. This is an example, not the purple one in the middle, but the burgundy colored capped mushrooms of those that have pores instead of gills. And the pores in this case would make this type of mushroom to fall into the boletes. And there are a multitude of bolete mushrooms that are edible. And when you look closer, you see there is not gills present, but pores or openings through which the spores are dropped out of tubes that they have been generated in. Now, there are some boletes that are considered toxic. And when I say toxic, it doesn't necessarily mean it's poisonous or deadly poisonous. It may simply mean that the consumption of that fungus will give gastrointestinal distress of different levels. Some people are much more sensitive to the toxins that may be present in a mushroom, and some can eat them without any negative side effects from them. So every time somebody consumes a different or new type of mushroom that they have not consumed before, one should not gobble down great quantities of it. They should just sample it, a little nibble of it here and there, and slowly introduce it into a diet if they're going to consume a mushroom. There are those mushrooms that have what are called false gills, such as the chanterelles and false chanterelles. Here you can see underneath the cap, if you want to call it a cap of this chanterelle or smooth chanterelle, there are no gills present. The spores are produced on a relatively flat surface underneath the edges of the cap of that mushroom. And the true chanterelle may have folds in the tissue underneath the cap, but again, not true gills and not pores, or at least not visible pores through which the spores are generated. And then there's all kinds of atypical caps, such as those that we find on the true morel mushrooms, as well as the false morel mushroom. This is a false morel. It does not have the same architecture to the cap as a true morel does. It also is not completely hollow on the interior of the mushroom. And some people can eat this one without any ill effects, and others will be very sick after consuming just even a few bites of that particular false morel. Then we get into the stinkhorns, and we really have some weird appearances in the stinkhorns. This is the devil's stinkhorn, and it has a loose cap on the tip of the stinkhorn. The common stinkhorn, it almost looks like a morel with the divots in the cap of that particular stinkhorn. Not exactly something you'd want to consume. I'm not sure you get it past your nose to eat it, even if you did. And then we have the dog stinkhorn, that the cap is just part of the stem. And there is no separation from the spore producing area and the rest of the stem of that stinkhorn. And these are all common stinkhorns that we have in Ohio at different times of the year. Some of our fungi are referred to as shelf or bracket or conchs, such as the artist conch that we have in this particular image here. One of the things that seems to go along with the description of being a bracket or a conch is it's frequently woody and characteristic and perennial. So there's layers upon layers of new tissue added to these particular shelf fungi on an annual basis. And underneath there, these are polypores. So they produce their spores through a tubular system, just like the boletes do. Now, these are all terms that can apply to this same type of polypore. There's the underside showing the spore producing surface. Now, there are pores in this surface, but they are so minute that it's very difficult to see the individual openings on the artist conch, which is Ganoderma applanatum. This would also be described as a shelf fungus, and in this case, it is an annual production. It is not a perennial, and it's a very soft tissue for the most part. And on the underside, it is still a polypore, and it has very large pores through which the spores are released out into the environment. And that one happens to be dryad saddle or pheasant's back. We'll see this one again a little bit later. And then there are some of the shelf fungi that when you look on the underside, they have gills, just like some of the capped types of mushrooms. This particular species is called orange mock oyster. It is a late season type of fungus that grows on highly rotted logs. And to me, when I look at a fresh sample of this particular mock oyster, it kind of reminds me of the creamsicle in terms of the orange coloration. But it's a very common late season fungus that can be found in many different woodlots. This is another shelf fungus here. It's also still an annual production. It's a relatively soft tissued shelf fungus. However, when you look on the underside of these shells, instead of pores or gills, it has an arrangement of teeth. So this is described as a toothed shelf fungus. Particularly, this is a northern toothed shelf fungus. It's not nearly as common as some of the others, but it has a very interesting appearance to the spore producing surface that we haven't seen on the other types of fungi so far. It's quite interesting when you find a sample of that. Another bracket fungus, here you can see the upper surface. This one happens to come off of oak logs specifically, and it is the thick mazed oak polypore. And so it's not exactly gills, it's close to a gill appearance, but these are hard ridges with deep grooves in between them, through which the spores are produced for this particular species of macrofungi. And this one, if you find this on an old log laying on the ground and there's no bark left on it, you can pretty well be certain that it is attached specifically to an oak log. The other types of shapes that we run into with the fungi in the field are going to be round or ball shaped. This is a real common puffball that we encounter usually in the fall of the season. It's called the pear-shaped puffball. It's probably one of our most common types of puffballs that we get in Ohio. And you can see they can be generated in huge masses on old dead logs laying on the ground. But occasionally you can also find them growing up a standing live tree. And unfortunately, that's going to be an indication of rot occurring in that standing tree. So it may not be standing long after we see that presence of the puffball on the trunk. There's quite a diversity of different types of puffballs. This one would be referred to as a spiny puffball. And as it matures, all of these spines begin cracking. It's almost like a skin over the surface of the puffball and falling away. And that's what you see remnants of that skin around this more mature version of that puffball. And just like the pear-shaped puffball, eventually it has a pore opening at the top through which, when it is stepped on or physically damaged by something, the spores will explode out of that opening and into the environment. As a kid, I know I played with puffballs all the time. Probably shouldn't have. I can't just imagine how many spores I sucked into my lungs by playing with puffballs. Now, hopefully without any ill effect. This is an unusual type of puffball. Many people overlook it simply because it might look like just a little pebble on the ground. And this happens to be in the Scleroderma group of puffballs. The other puffballs can be eaten when they're still white on the interior. This group of puffballs is toxic and is not a recommended edible. Scleroderma, sclera and derma meaning hard skin. The outer rind on this puffball is very tough. And as this puffball matures, eventually it starts just cracking open. And on the interior, the spores are purple in color. And so when those are released, it'll give you a little bit of a purple haze coming from that. There are a couple of different varieties of this type of puffball. Sometimes it's called an earth ball. This one is called the pigskin puffball. There's another one that's called the spud puffball because it looks more like a potato than anything else. And then we get into the much larger puffballs, and these were very abundant here in the past couple of weeks. I find this particular type in grassy areas. And as it matures, it goes from having a white interior to a yellowish interior. And eventually, when it's fully mature, it will be purple on the inside. And so this one is the purple spored puffball. When you pull those off and roll them over, you'll see that they have direct connection to the soil. I found them in fairy rings, in athletic fields, as well as in cemeteries. And it's much more common than what many people realize it is. Often, however, they get run over by lawnmowers and the tops get chopped off of them. And so sometimes what you will find is a bowl, the outer what was left of the outer skin of the puffball, and just this mass of purple, dark purple spores left on the interior. Now that will be spread by the wind or spread by the lawnmower the next time it gets run over in that turf grass area. There are a few of our fungi that belong to the Ascomycota and produce what are referred to as the cup-shaped fungi. These are vary in size. Some are really minute, and some of them are fairly large, as the sample that I have here in my hand. And the spores are released from the interior of that bowl. It was kind of interesting when I found this particular specimen. It was on a nice warm April morning, and while I was standing there looking at it, it appeared to start smoking. And what it was doing, it was releasing batches of spores out of the pores on the interior surface of this. And it was literally coming up in almost whiffs of smoky appearance coming out of that. Some of the smaller types of cup fungi include the eyelash cup. These are pretty easy to find on very highly rotted logs, but you have to be looking fairly close because they aren't very big. The largest one here might be 3/8 of an inch in diameter, and they aren't very tall. They're very close to the surface of the wood. They tend to be in heavy shaded areas of the woodlot where moisture tends to be fairly available. So you have to be paying pretty close attention to see these as they're developing. And I see there was a note that unfortunately my internet connection may not be the best, and my voice is cutting in and out. I apologize for that. Unfortunately, we don't always have the best internet connection out here away from big cities. All right. Next, we see the coral-shaped and the club-shaped fungi. This one is called the crown-tipped coral. This will appear several times through the growing season, and they do generate a lot of these in the fall of the year as well. Some of these are edible, but some of these are not. So you really have to be careful of identifying the different coral fungi that you may encounter. And you can see why it's called a coral fungi. It does look like an undersea coral growing on the log, a highly rotted log in the woodlot. Not pointing out the Indian pipes here, which is actually an angiosperm flowering plant, but the little yellow clubs fungi that happen to be in the background. When I took this picture originally, I was actually taking a picture of the Indian pipes. And it wasn't until after I downloaded the images, I noticed I had captured the club fungus growing behind the Indian pipes. And then there's a lot of other different types of shapes, like the spatula-shaped jelly fungus. There's the bird nest fungi, and this one happens to be called the cauliflower fungus. So there's quite a diversity and unusual shapes that you can encounter throughout the woodlot if you're walking through the woodlot frequently and paying attention to what's at your feet. Where do they grow? Where do I find them? Well, many of them grow right on the soil, such as the emetic ruschula that you see here. It is obtaining organic material from the soil, so it's decomposing, digesting whatever organic materials accumulated in the soil and growing right on the surface of the soil. Many others, such as the chicken of the woods that we have here, grow on wood. However, sometimes you might find a chicken of woods that looks like it's growing directly out of the soil. However, if you remove a little bit of the soil off the surface, you'll probably find a branch or a root composed of wood just underneath the surface of the soil. So things like chicken of the woods is absolutely a wood decomposing type of fungus that will always be attached to wood a wood source somewhere where you find it growing. And then you even have fungi that grow on fungi. The fungus that's being eaten by the slug in the background here, that one happens to be bleeding mycena. And the foreground one, the bleeding mycena cap that looks like it's hairy, that's being consumed by a fungus called the bonnet mold. And it's quite a spectacular find when you see these. See these long mycelial threads sticking out, and at the very tips of them are the packets of spores that that fungus is producing to spread itself from one mycena mushroom to another. So sometimes you have to look kind of closely, and you get 2 for 1 if you're happen to be at the right place at the right time. Diversity in size. Here you can see I'm holding on to a little shagbar kikri nut, and growing out of the husk of that nut is probably the walnut mycena. And it just hasn't completely developed its color as of yet, but it's very tiny, not quite microscopic, but it's pretty close. Here in my fingertips is a little shelf fungus that would be called a crep. It's CREP fungus, very delicate, pure white in color, growing on the base of a rotting log. And then we can run into monsters, such as the one that's being held here with 2 hands. That is one of the Agaricus fungi that can be growing in meadows and grassy areas. So quite a range in sizes that can be encountered. Here's an example of a comb tooth fungus, and it was massive. I discovered this one walking through a woodlot, and I was yards away from the log that you see there, and this brilliant white mass was easily seen from a great distance. So there is quite a range in size. Where do you find them? Well, this is another thing. Just about every habitat, there's going to be one kind of fungus or another that can be growing there. And you can find them from the forest floor, like the chanterelles here on the forest floor in this image, to the tops of trees. And if you notice, way up on the probably a good 50, 60 feet in the air, there's some orange spots on the trunk of that tree where chicken of the woods was growing out the side of that trunk because it had been injured by a large cottonwood tree that had fallen down and scraped down the entire length of that tree trunk. And every place that the bark had been broken open by the falling of the other tree, the chicken of the woods had established and was growing out at different levels along the length of that trunk. Some of our fungi are associated with specific tree types, and knowing the tree species can lead to the identification of the fungus that is growing on it. And in this case, the tree that is hosting this particular shelf fungus is black locust tree. And that tells me immediately that this particular polypore is the cracked cap polypore, which is specific to black locust trees. And it's a very interesting perennial fungus that will grow year after year on that same position, adding to its size and girth. And eventually, over time, it will lead to the demise of the black locust tree. When do I find the different fungi? Well, almost all year round. There are fungi that will take advantage of just a short time period in the middle of winter when the temperatures rise up around 50 degrees. They'll suddenly appear on the scene, such as the velvet stem or velvet foot fungus that you see here on the right-hand side. This was a very, very early spring, probably the beginning of April, maybe the end of March, that these were already showing up on the trunks of trees. And they can be found, and I found them as late as December 25th and other places. So they can grow just about any time through the season if there's just a little bit of warmth available for them. This is also referred to as the inotaki mushroom when it's very small and grown in the dark. Some of our fungi are very common, such as the dryad saddle. You can almost be guaranteed to find that just about anywhere. And then some are very common, but have a very short season, such as the morels. If you're not in the right place at the right time, you're not going to find them, which has been my luck for the most part. Some are rare, and they just aren't very often visible to be captured and identified. Most of our fungi are going to be active from sometime April through the end of October. So that growing season, when warmth and moisture is available, is when we find most of our actively growing fungi, or at least the reproductive structures that we can identify them by. Here's an example of an oyster mushroom. And this oyster mushroom, I happened to be traveling for a Christmas holiday. And as I was returning into Ohio, I stopped at a small park just to take a break from driving and discovered this trunk of a tree that had freshly grown oyster mushrooms on the surface of the trunk. And it just so happened to be, it was a little warm the day before and a couple of days before, and they sprung forth. But the day that I was there, temperatures had fallen below freezing. And so you can see ice crystals on the surface of the oyster mushroom. So you just never know when you might stumble upon a fresh grown mushroom throughout the growing season, or even into a time that you wouldn't think anything was growing there. How do I find the diversity of fungi that I have photographed over the years? Frequent visits to the same woodlots. I have about 7 different woodlots that I walk on a fairly regular basis just to be able to find the diversity of fungi that are present there. When I walk trails, I tend to walk both directions because you may miss something on one side of the trail or the other that you didn't see on the first pass through that you may see on the return trip. Examine down logs, dead tree trunks, and stumps. Many of these are associated with the decaying wood, and so they are hosted by a number of those dead trees. Revisit sites a couple of days after a rainfall event, sometimes up to a week after, and that can bring on a number of the fungi because of a moisture requirement for their growth and development. And just slow down and take your time as you're walking through a woodlot and look around and look at the ground and look up, and you may discover many more fungi than what you might have known was there before. And then, of course, look for splashes of color, such as the chicken of the woods that was growing on the log in a distance up the trail that I spotted because I looked up at the right time and saw all of that brilliant orange color, or white can stand out pretty well against dark colored logs. Sometimes you have to look under the logs. Here's a large bolete that was hidden underneath a log that was just a few inches off the ground. And if I hadn't basically kneeled down to look at this little fungus, I would have never noticed the bolete that was hidden underneath the trunk of the tree. They also change in appearance as they're growing. And as their early stages of growth, you may not immediately recognize them for what they are. So these rivet-like structures that were growing out the side of the trunk of the tree, as I returned to that a little later on, it was taking on a bit more of its typical form. And then eventually it became very recognizable as the dryad saddle or pheasant's back polypore. And then once it was fully mature, it was very obvious as to what that fungus happened to be. In this case, there were multiple stages all in the same tree trunk, from that rivet-like stage all the way up to fully expanded plates of the pheasant back or the dryad saddle. And Cereoporus squamosus, this used to be referred in a genus called polyporus, but it's been changed by the systematists as they examine the systematic relationships between the different fungi, and names, unfortunately, are constantly changing as to what genera they may belong to. Usually the species epithet stays the same, but the genus and the family and other levels of taxonomy may change. You may find it referred to as Polyporus squamosus in older field guides, but the newer editions of field guides will have those changes made in them. So here's the big question. How can you be sure you know your ID is correct? And there are a lot of confusing fungi out there in the woods, and it does require some detailed examination of the specimen and looking for the different characteristics to truly be able to feel certain that your identification is correct. Don't assume that we know all fungi, such as the sample that I have here on the right-hand side. I still haven't been able to identify what that species is. And it may simply be that it wasn't mature enough to show all the characteristics that I needed. Work with experienced people. We have an Ohio Mushroom Association in Ohio, and joining that association and going on forays with the groups of people that have foraged for years and learning from their experience can help tremendously. If you don't take the time to ID your fungus correctly, you will make mistakes, and mistakes can be hazardous to your health if you're consuming those fungi that you are finding. And all fungi can't be easily identified or separated in the field. We can get them close to an identification, but as I've mentioned already before, sometimes you have to do things in a laboratory to be able to fully identify to species what you are working with. So here's a case in point, one that I'm struggling with myself at the current time. In Northwest Ohio, we have massive groups of fungi growing in rings, fairy rings, in grassy areas. The possibilities are very wide as to what the identification of the fungus may be. As you look at these different mushrooms a little more closely, nice bright white caps, in a button stage at this time, but some of them are a bit more mature. So when you look at the color of the gills underneath, you can see they have a little bit of a pinkish coloration to them. There is a very distinct annulus skirt type of ring on the stem, and the stem is relatively straight, but it does swell a little bit as you get down to the bottom. And at this point, one might think, well, it's growing in grassy area. It has a little bit of a pinkish color to the gills. It's a white mushroom. This may very well be the meadow mushroom. But then again, maybe not. Looking at additional specimens, you can see that some of these are rather large mushrooms. And surprisingly, the true meadow mushroom is not that big of a mushroom. Its cap is only about 3 inches in diameter at most. Many of them others are much smaller than that. And all of these mushroom caps growing in several fairy rings are much bigger. They're closer to 6 to 7 and sometimes bigger than 8 inches in diameter, which should make you hesitate a little bit to call that the meadow mushroom. And they are turning dark brown underneath, which of course is a characteristic of just about any of the Agaricus mushrooms. So what kind of mushrooms are these? And notice They start out in the white button, but they can grow into incredibly large specimens. And here's a fully mature specimen in my hand. I was struggling to hold this while I was taking pictures because it weighed a couple of pounds. And the diameter of the stem there is close to 3 inches in diameter. The cap, there's a 12-inch cap on that one. That is not a meadow mushroom, or at least it's not the meadow mushroom that was described for the species. The length of the stem was close to 7 inches from the top of the cap down to the bottom of the stem. And then even the buttons were rather massive for the specimens that I was encountering. But when we did look at, or I looked at the partial veil on the underside, one of the characteristics to look at there is it has a cog-like appearance to it. So it almost looks like a gear with cogs around there. And if you start reading the descriptions of some of the Agaricus mushrooms, that puts it into a little bit different category. And here's another thing that was quite important to look at. When I cut open the button mushroom, the gills at this time are pretty much white in color. And a meadow mushroom, which is Agaricus campestris, never has white gills. So it's definitely not a meadow mushroom. So the meadow mushroom is out. In fact, some of the most recent research that has been published by a world-renowned Agaricus researcher, he has discovered that we probably don't even have the meadow mushroom species in the United States. It is a European mushroom, and it's very common in Europe, but it may not be common, if at all, in especially the eastern United States. Is it the horse mushroom, Agaricus arvensis? Yeah, it's a possibility, but even Agaricus arvensis, even though it can have a large cap, 6 to 7 inches in diameter, isn't as big as the ones that are popping up at this time of the year. It may be the fissured mushroom, Agaricus fissuratus, and part of the description of that species is that as these large caps age, they turn a little bit yellowish in color, and they can break or crack or fissure open. And that's what a lot of these specimens were actually doing. There's several possibilities. This one, the fissured mushroom, may be the most accurate identification. So the ultimate question that I get by many people is they'll bring these huge mushrooms in and say, can I eat them? Well, I usually don't like to make that determination because if you make a mistake, it could be a bad mistake. There are some Agaricus mushrooms that are toxic, not deadly toxic, but they can make you ill if you eat them. So you really do need to be sure of your identification. I think it's a little bit too cavalier when people just assume, oh, it's growing in grass, it must be a meadow mushroom, let's eat them. It could result in negative effects afterwards. And we'll encounter this again with some of the other mushrooms that people tend to very somewhat glibly say, oh, I know what that is, and just go on and use it as the type of mushroom that they think it is and haven't taken the time to truly identify it. Also, right out there intermixed with the Agaricus mushrooms are the Leucoagaricus mushrooms, specifically Leucoagaricus leucothites. And this is a pure white mushroom. And when you see them, they are brilliant white. They are completely white. The cap's white, the gill's white, the stem's white, the annulus ring is white, and it stays white even when it's fully mature. And these have been super abundant here in Northwest Ohio in the past couple of weeks. The Leucoagaricus, you can see it starts out as a button type of mushroom. It's not very, very big. Some of the biggest specimens might be 4 inches in diameter with the cap. They might change a little bit off-white as they completely mature. The spores are white, so it doesn't change the color of the gills as it matures. And the most bizarre thing is I was driving down a country road and noticed an agricultural field that when I looked out across the field, I thought somebody had scattered white chicken eggs across the entire field. And I've never really seen this amount of mushroom growth on an agricultural field. Obviously, it was a soybean field that was harvested a couple of weeks ago. And these Agaricus mushrooms were just exploding across the entire field. And the common name that's sometimes applied to this particular one is the white dapperling mushroom or the smooth parasol mushroom. And it is presumably edible, but for some individuals, they will react negatively to it. So there's a little bit of a toxic chemical present in it that some that are more sensitive than others will react negatively to. The other thing is, if I'll back up here for a second, when you look at the Agaricus mushroom, a pure white mushroom, and you notice that the stem connects directly to the soil. So it is decomposing organic material in soil, but there's nothing around the base of that stem. So there isn't a cup, an additional cup around that base. And it is very important when you're collecting mushrooms that you go all the way down to where that mushroom is connected to the base of the ground to make sure there isn't a cup around the base of the stem, because specifically of the Amanita mushrooms. And the Amanita mushrooms will have that vulva or a cup around the base of the stem. Now, this produced a complete veil over top of the mushroom when it was first developing it. And it looks kind of like an egg coming up out of the soil. And when that full veil breaks open to release the capped mushroom out, it also has a partial veil that was over top of the gills, and it produces a skirt around the stem. But specifically, the Amanita bisporigia is referred to as the destroying angel. This is one of our most toxic mushrooms that we have in Ohio. And you must look very carefully at the base of a pure white mushroom, whether it's growing in turf grass, meadow grass, or inside of a woodlot. You really have to dig underneath that mushroom, not just cut it off along the stem and assume that you know what it is. That mistake could be your last mistake. And the old saying that there are bold mushroom hunters and old mushroom hunters, but no old mushroom hunters applies to this situation where if you just cut them off without paying attention to the base of the stem, it could be your last collection. And I've also said every mushroom's edible at least once. You may never eat one again, but every mushroom's edible once. Here's another situation that I find a little disturbing. There are the varnished or lacquered conchs that belong to the Ganoderma species of fungi. These are shelf fungi. They tend to be woody as they mature. And the one that is collected most frequently for folk medicine or natural medicinal purposes is Ganoderma lucidum. This is another type of mushroom that has been determined through recent research that it almost does not exist anywhere in the United States. It is an Asian and European species. It has been used extensively in Asian culture for medicinal purposes, where the cap of the mushroom is collected, it's ground, and teas are made out of it for a number of different medicinal purposes, of which I don't know if any of them have been proven via research, but they are a long traditional mushroom for medicinal purposes. Now, we have several different species of Ganoderma fungi in the United States. And I hear a lot of people on different websites saying, oh, I found the Ganoderma lucidum, we collected it, we're using it for making teas, and they haven't really taken the time to identify them properly. As you can see, the research that was done here in the United States, where they looked at multitudes of collections of Ganoderma mushrooms, they found that there were only a couple of places where Ganoderma lucidum was collected in the United States, Northern California and Utah, where they probably escaped from some cultivation production of Ganoderma lucidum. Most of the other Ganoderma, well, almost all of the other Ganoderma belong to different species other than lucidum. And so the lingchi or the rishii are the common names that are used in the Asian countries to refer to this particular species, really should not be used to refer to the lacquered polypores that we have here in the United States. And we do have a multitude of them. So they have this varnished or lacquered appearance, some portion of the polypore. And they start out with this pretty shiny, robust appearance to them. Some of them have stems that connect them to the wood that they are decomposing. And some are connected directly without a stem to the wood. As they age, they turn into this reddish brown color, but they still have the shininess of the lacquered appearance. This one is Ganoderma curtisi, and it is not lucidum. It does look a little bit like it, but it is not that particular species. Others, here you can see some very large examples of a lacquered polypore growing at the base of a honey locust tree, and they were still developing. They are connected to the wood of the roots and decomposing those roots. Some of them look like they have no lacquered, but if you look at the stems underneath, they're definitely a lacquered polypore. Again, you can see this new specimen growing up out of the soil connected to the roots underneath the ground. It's still Ganoderma curtisi. And here's a different species that's actually growing on a stump that had been cut off. We can find that same species growing as a bracket that is connected directly to the trunk of a tree here. This one happens to be Ganoderma sessile, and a lot of the Ganoderma that I've encountered are the Ganoderma sessile. Again, not lucidum. They do overwinter. It is an annual growth, but you can still find these polypores from one season to the next. This is what it looked when it was actively growing out of a stump that was ground, and only little bits of the stump were still exposed. The next season, that very same Ganoderma was still present there. It was no longer actively growing. This had enough woodiness to it that it could still be found, but it would regenerate through the season as new growth from the stump that was present there. So this one is that one in this image here. So it can persist, but it's not going to regrow as a perennial type of fungus. And when I kicked it over and rolled it over, the undersurface was no longer actively growing. It lost most of its lacquered appearance, but I knew what it was. In addition to it, all these beautiful fungus feeding beetles were overwintering underneath that bracket fungus. So Here's another example of another lacquered polypore, a very distinctive shape to this with a very heavy stem and a semicircle appearance to the cap itself. And there were several specimens scattered around this particular tree. And fortunately, I happened to go back to that same site later in the season, and this is what it looked like in the late fall. It still has a little bit of a shiny appearance to it. Part of it's hidden under the spores that have been released and have floated up and landed on top of it. Another specimen, what it looked like later on in the season. So it did persist. This particular group of Ganoderma was associated with a hemlock tree. And when it's associated with hemlock tree, it is Ganoderma tsugae. And Ganoderma tsugae is one that is toxic and should not be used for making teas for medicinal purposes. So knowing which species you have is very important when you're working with these. And again, my concern is when people see a lacquered polypore and immediately assume that it's Ganoderma lucidum, they could be making some pretty serious mistakes by not realizing that Ganoderma lucidum does not exist in the United States. What about chicken of the woods? And this is a fresh specimen. I just found it a day or so ago. Beautiful oranges and yellow colors. The undersurface or the spore producing surface is brilliant yellow. And now it kind of looks a little bit white from the side, but when you directly look on it, it has this sulfur yellow appearance to it. These are the typical characteristics of the polypore that is referred to as Ladioporus sulphureus. And that would be one that's referred to as the chicken of the woods. However, here we have another polypore. It has that brilliant orange coloration with some yellow in it, but the spore producing surface underneath is pure white. It's not yellow. And sometimes these polypore can have a little bit of a pinkish coloration, and this specimen even more so with that pinkish coloration. This is another species, and it is still Ladioporus, but this time it's cincinnatus. So there are a couple of very similar appearing polypores out there that both of them are called chicken of the woods. And so it's more than one species that falls under that common name, chicken of the woods. The other thing that I've run onto, there's quite a variety in their appearances. Thicknesses of the shells, coloration, banding on it, still yellow on the underside, but look how thin that plate is for that particular specimen versus this one over here, where the thickness of the plates or the shells are almost double that of the previous specimen. Could this just be an artifact of aging? And as it dries out, it gets thinner, or are we potentially looking at subspecies of the polypores that have that connotation of being called chicken of the woods? Here's another example. When you look at the thickness of the different plates, or in this particular example, it's got a very different growth pattern to it than the ones over here, and still has that brilliant yellow coloration to it. Is this another subspecies? Is this the same species? I'm not entirely certain. And it could be environmental, it could be age, or it could even be the host species that it's growing on. Chicken of the woods is typically associated with oak trees, but it's not exclusive to oak. This sample here is growing on an old ash tree. I've also seen and taken pictures of it on honey locust trees. Does the host influence the growth pattern of it? Will it have the same taste if it's on a different species of hardwood tree? These are a lot of questions that I'm not sure anybody's fully answered. And whether it's exactly the same species may only be able to be determined by doing DNA analysis on them. All right, then we have ones that are called hen of the woods. Are hen of the woods the same as chicken of the woods? Yeah, no, they're not. It's another polypore. It's highly associated with oak trees, especially large old oak trees. And it can be tan to almost a gray black color on the surface, partially depending on age, partially dependent on exposure. But the undersides of the plates of this polypore are pure white. And it is a very dense growth. This particular one, even though it was pretty small, it had a lot of weight to that specimen, probably a couple of pounds for not an overly large example of this fungus. And obviously I've broken it open to show the denseness of the tissues on the interior, pure white. Probably one of the biggest challenges if you're going to collect and eat a hen of the woods is all of these cracks and crevices, the number of insects that can hide down in there, the dirt that can get down in there can be difficult to clean those out easily. And why do they call it hen of the woods? Maybe because it is nestled in between the large brace roots of the oak tree. So it looks like a chicken huddled in its nest down in between those large roots of the oak tree. It is a decomposer of the oak wood, but it must be a very, very slow decomposition because I've seen very old oak trees that produce these hen of the woods year after year after year and don't appear to have any major rot of the wood itself. Genus species name Grifolia frondosa, probably referring to the fronds or the multitudes of plates that go into making up the shelf fungus here. It's also called Miyataki as a store-bought type of mushroom. Here's another polypore that you can sometimes find nestled around the big brace roots of oak trees. Berkeley's polypore looks a little bit similar to hen of the woods, but when you look at it more closely, it's not nearly as dense as the hen of the woods. It still has multiple plates that make up the overall polypore. Its genus species name is Bondersuia berkeleyi. And I think the genus name has changed on this one fairly recently. It had a different genus name just a few years ago. It's kind of a pretty specimen. It can be very large. So you can see a quarter sitting on one of the plates of the polypore, just for size reference. And this was a younger specimen that was still expanding when I found it. Another fungus that I found nestled in the brace roots of an old oak tree is this bright orange specimen here. The orangeness to this is a deep pumpkin colored orange. It grows as a group of capped mushrooms, all from a common growing point. And it is a gilled capped mushroom where it has decurrent gills that run down the stems. And when you cut these in cross section, it's orange throughout its entire tissues. This is the jack-o'-lantern fungus. It is a toxic fungus. Even though it looks a little bit like chicken of the woods with its orange color, that is not an edible mushroom. It is a wood rotter, and so unfortunately it is working on the oak wood of the specimen that it was growing under. It happened to be a very large chinkapin oak. And if you've noticed, a number of my pictures have cemeteries in the background. It's a great place to find a diversity of fungi growing that don't get disturbed too often. And the genus species name Omphalotus olearius is its genus species name. Other polypore diversity, and you've already seen the artist conch. This is another Ganoderma, Ganoderma appellatum, and it is a very common polypore that grows on a multitude of different hardwood trees. And so it's not very species specific. It's easy to find. It's a perennial, so it has literally rings like the trunk of a tree on the interior of those plates, and it will keep on adding to it until eventually it dies. Looking at up in this particular tree, you can see another polypore growing up in here, and it looks very similar to the artist conch, but not quite as white on that spore producing surface. And this one happens to be very highly associated with one type of tree, and that tree is the ash. And this is the ash-loving polypore. And it will only be found on ash trees, so it could be an endangered species since our ash trees have been so highly destroyed by the emerald ash borer. And then we saw the cracked capped polypore before. Looks a little bit similar to the artist conch, but it is specific to black locust trees. So here's two different polypores that are very specific in their hosts that they will utilize versus the artist conch that has a wide variety of trees that it will utilize. Very similar in appearance with slight deviations in their characteristics, but could be easily confused with one another if you didn't slow down and really look at what the different host trees were that they were growing on. And here's an example of that ringed appearance of those perennial polypores with each additional year's new growth added on top of the previous year. And this specimen I happen to be holding upside down. So this is the most recent layer of spore production on that artist conch that I had broken in half to show those annual growth rings that it produces. Here's another polypore, looks kind of similar to the artist conch. However, this is an annual growth. It is not a perennial polypore. It is a late season fall polypore. Actually, it can be very attractive when you see it, but also notice that there's liquid laying on the surface of that polypore. This is the resinous polypore, a very, very common one that you can find on rotting logs on the ground late in the season. In fact, it's growing right now in a number of woodlots that I visit. Smaller polypores, here we have turkey tail, true turkey tail, and over here we have false turkey tail. And another one that is similar in size, similar in appearance, this is the violet-toothed polypore. So how can you distinguish between turkey tail, false turkey tail, and violet-toothed polypore? You got to look on the underside. True turkey tail, you can actually see the pores on the underside of the surface. It's a fairly thin polypore, but you can see that there are pore openings on this white surface underneath. The false turkey tail, on the other hand, is perfectly smooth. The spore producing surface doesn't have visible pores in it like the true turkey tail does. So this is more of a parchment type of fungus. And then when we look on the underside of the violet tooth polypore, not only does it have a purplish color to the underside, but there are tiny teeth-like points that are pointing down on the undersurface. So by knowing these different characters, you can separate these three small polypores that look very similar to one another in the field. And then just a few additional ones before we stop to take some questions or answer the questions that have been accumulating in the question and answer area. Some of the oddballs that you might run onto include the old man of the woods. Not entirely certain why they call it old man of the woods, other than maybe it just has a scruffy appearance of a bearded old man that hasn't shaved for a few days. It is a bolete, and it does produce spores through those tubes on the underside. And in this particular case, for this specimen, it happened to be sitting over top of a log where the pore openings were right on top of the surface of the log. And you can literally see the accumulation of the spores that have dumped out of that cap. And you can see little piles of spores that it left behind. So old man of the woods, fairly common. I have found it in a multitude of woodlots around Northwest Ohio. This is kind of an unusual looking comb-toothed fungus called lion's mane. And you can see I've placed quarters on the surface of them to give you some dimensions of how large these are. And it has these long jelly-like teeth that hang underneath the basically shelf fungus that we're seeing here. It is presumably a cherished edible mushroom. These are a little bit old, and they were beginning to degrade on the upper surface, so that one was probably beyond the edible stage. I've cut it open to show you the accumulation of long teeth that hang underneath that particular fungus. And it was growing on an old oak log, and there were a multitude of them. It was a bit of a challenge for me to get to these. I was walking in a park over on this side, and there was a stream with a pretty muddy bottom in between me and this log. And it took a while to find a narrow place in the stream to get to the other side. But I did work at it pretty hard because of the beautiful specimens that were present there. And it was late in the season. You can see that leaves were already falling, and the leaves in the background are changing colors. So it appeared in the late fall. There's the bear's head toothed fungus. It looks fairly similar to the lion's mane, but it tends to be more of a pile of the teeth rather than a hanging underneath of a shelf. This one's fairly old, already turning color. A fresh specimen tends to be pure white in its appearance. And when you look closer, you can see it has multitudes of teeth from a branching appearance of that particular fungus. And then the comb-tooth fungus looks similar to the bear's head tooth fungus. However, the teeth are more held apart from one another. They're shorter, but somewhat similar. And here's that large toothed mushroom that I had earlier in the presentation. You can see the distance away from it, that it stood out in the background. And as it got closer and closer, you can see the fine teeth of that comb-tooth fungus. And I broke off a piece. Kind of looks a little bit like cauliflower, but you can see how dense that growth can be. Interesting one that I find on old beach logs on a regular basis, the coral pink Morels. It's a very rubbery type of shelf fungus. Only find it late in the season. In fact, fresh specimens are found right now. And on the undersurface, it has this wrinkled appearance to the spore-producing surface. And I found several specimens over the years. This coral pink coloration stands out pretty vividly when you're walking through the woods. Tree ear or wood ear, there's several other names that can be used for it, but it literally does look like an old man's ear when you take it off the log. Kind of a gelatinous type of fungus that does dry out when it gets hot and dry, and when it rains, it resaturates and will re-expand. And it can appear on a multitude of different hardwood trees, and just an interesting fungus that you can come upon. A very pretty guild fungus is one called the wrinkled peach, and it does have a peachy coloration to it. Fresher specimens are more peachy in color, but the most unique characteristic is this articulated surface to the mushroom. Presumably, it's common, but rare to find. You just have to be at the right place at the right time to see them. An oddball is the dead man's finger type of fungus. It does kind of look like a ghoulish type of finger sticking out of decaying wood. Sometimes you can find multitudes of them, like there is a zombie inside of the stump working its way.
Hey, everybody. It seems that we lost Curtis. So hang in tight with us and we'll see if we can get him back. Just a reminder, this is one of the things we run into when we do webinars. It is reliant completely on internet connections. Yes, Cynthia, zombie got Curtis. Something. So it's not your connection. That's definitely on Curtis's end. And I'm sure right now he's frantically trying to figure it out. Really good information so far. And I've just been looking through your questions. Really good questions. So hopefully we can get him back.
To answer those questions.
Yes. 'Cause I don't think Kathy and I can.
There's a few there I could probably tackle, but
There's only one I could tackle. That's about it. I just texted him, reminding him he can at least call back in with his cell phone. I'm going to try to text him the number too, in case he just completely lost internet. He said he's trying to call in right now. Let's see if I can get him the number. 8229. Yeah, he said he was trying, and now I have not gotten anything from him. Okay, yes, Teresa wants to know about some upcoming programs. Good question, Teresa. So we have been working on getting some programs in Southwest Ohio. We did one at the end of September on tree ID, and that was at Warren County Fairgrounds. And we have another few classes coming up. October 28th, we have a wildlife complex course that I'm teaching along with Melissa Profit with Warren County SWCD. So that's October 28th, and that is up on our website if you want to register for that. And again, these are in-person classes. And then what's our next one, Kathy? Is it December 2nd?
December, yeah.
Yeah, December 2nd, we have again an invasives class in Warren County. And then Kathy and I need to meet to talk about getting some programs probably at the OSU Field campus coming into the new year. So that's where we're at on programming. Kathy, jump in if I'm missing
We
stuff.
do have next month's webinar is November 19th. And it is with Enrico Bonello talking about mycorrhizae. As soon as he gets me a description for that one, I'll send and Marnie gives me the registration, we'll send that out as well. And there's,
I think it is. I don't know what his number is.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's his. Let me make certain. But he needs to unmute himself anyhow.
Oh, yeah. Which I think is *6 when you call in. Yeah, I don't see any other numbers, so I think that's him.
Yep, that's him.
Yep, okay.
So someone asked, how do you find this webinar recording? Go to our woodlandstewards.osu.edu website, and under the tab resources, there's a side tab for webinars, and that's where it will be posted. And I can put that in the box.
We have all of our webinars posted that we've been doing for the past year and a half. So you can always go back and view them if you missed one or
There,
do it. There he is.
There he is.
yeah,
Woohoo.
yeah. Sorry about that. My internet just shut down on me. Yeah, the hazards of doing. All right, so obviously can't show any more of the specimens, but I can answer questions.
We have quite a few.
We have quite a few.
So go ahead then.
Okay.
If you,
So let's see. First one is from Sarah, and she says she's having a hard time distinguishing between shelf and bracket fungi.
well, shelf and bracket, they're pretty much the same thing. It's just a description of the form of the fungus. So it just, you could call it a dinner plate. You could call it a shelf simply because it's a flat, semicircular growth that is hanging on a log or a tree. So it's just a general description term.
Okay. Anonymous asks, can you recommend a good fungi ID book in general and a good ID book for fungi in relation to tree decay? Overall, just trying to find a good ID book to help determine the fungi on and around trees that I see to better understand what's going on inside the tree. And Curtis, I have a feeling you're like me with tree books. You've got a dozen plus.
Yeah, at least a dozen different books. Unfortunately, if we had this in person in meeting, we had a nice little pocket guide that I ran onto. It's called A Simple Guide to Common Mushrooms, Mushrooms of the Upper Midwest, 2nd edition, by Teresa Marone and Kathy Urich. And Kathy, I think you had purchased a supply for us.
Yep,
but
there's
unfortunately,
a case and a half sitting in the storage room.
I'll see if I can find a link to it. Is it posted? Oh,
yeah, it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, we bought it from Amazon.
I'll put a link in the chat box, folks.
Any others you want to talk about, Curtis?
Well, if you can find one or ones that are oriented toward the northeastern United States, Midwestern United States, and try to avoid any of those that are more specific to the western coast, because their fungi will be a little different than the ones that you're going to generally see here in Ohio. And let me see, another one that I have, Mushrooms of Northeast North America, Midwest to New England by George Barron. It's a Lone Pine Field Guide, is a decent one. We have our own OSU field guide to a number of the common macrofungi that's available through e-stores through Ohio State. And then some individual fact sheets, websites. One website that I use on a regular basis is called Mushroom Expert. And the Mushroom Expert website is a very extensive website. It's primarily works from genus species names, but can find some of the common names associated with that website, and it does not talk about anything about edibility of mushrooms on that website.
What was that website again?
There is Mushroom Expert, the Mushroom Expert. I think it might be
mushroomexpert.com.
Yes, it is a .com. And then Messiah College in Pennsylvania has a fungi that decay wood website, and it has a nice selection of those fungi that are specifically associated with decaying wood.
See if I can.
So yeah, just do Messiah College wood decay and it'll pop up.
Yep, got it.
Okay.
Cool.
So Teresa asks, are there any fungi that you should not handle with your bare hands?
All the toxicity to fungi is associated with ingestion. And I've handled every single fungus that I've taken a picture of with bare hands with impunity.
Okay.
So, no.
James asks, that's good. James asks, what are some of the rare fungi and where do they occur?
Oh, rare fungi. Well, to me, a rare fungus is the Morels, because I just haven't found the right place to look for them. The wrinkled peach, it's just happenstance. I've run onto them a couple of different times in woodlots with dead logs scattered around, and it just, I've only encountered them 2 or 3 times and had the opportunity to take pictures of them at that time. Other rare ones. That's a little harder question to answer other than those couple.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of running on to the rare ones. In some of the field guides, and I can't quite remember which one, whether it's one of the ones that we've already mentioned, we'll describe the mushrooms and say how often one might encounter them in the descriptions.
Okay. So Rick asks, can fungi in woods provide an indicator of the overall health of the timber? For example, finding fungi growing in the soil near black walnut or oaks, can it be a concern? If so, what can be done about it?
What can be done is nothing, unfortunately. Because once the mycelium of a fungus is in the wood of a tree and has begun the decomposition process, there's no way that you can extract it out of that tree. There isn't a chemical injection, a chemical treatment, even pruning. You will never know for sure whether it's been removed or not. Does every mushroom growing around a tree indicate problems? No, it doesn't. There are certainly a multitude of fungi that are mycorrhizal. In other words, they are living with the plant, and the two of them are benefiting from the association between the two. So in some cases, you really do want to see those fungi growing around the base of the tree, because it's an indication that the appropriate mycorrhizal fungus is present.
Okay. Sheila asks, can you eat mushrooms after they have iced over a bit, assuming they were edible?
I don't know that many people who forage for mushrooms will freeze them to preserve them for later use. So if it is an edible fungus, it can be frozen. I suspect, as with any kind of food, depending on the consistency of the fungus to begin with, some may freeze better than others. So I have not heard of any scenario or situation that would say that it changes its chemical structure to take it from an edible mushroom to an inedible mushroom because of being frozen.
Okay. So Frank asks, what critters eat what mushrooms and how important are mushrooms to wildlife?
There are quite a few different wildlife animals, mammals that will consume mushrooms on a regular basis. Squirrels eat them, chipmunks, deer, you name it. There are a number of mammals that eat mushrooms, but don't trust them to tell you which ones are toxic and which ones aren't, because they have very different digestive abilities that humans don't have. So you can't watch what the animals are eating to say, well, that must be safe to eat. It may very well not be. And then there are, as you saw in some of the images, slugs will eat the fungi, snails, and there's a ton of insects that will eat fungi and are quite competitive for getting to the cherished fungi before you do.
Wildlife are like that. So Lori asks, you mentioned the demise of black locust from its specific fungus. Would the tree have to have been already under stress to have the fungus growing on it?
That's a good question. I suspect that there may have been a bit of damage that opened it up to the spore landing on it and having access. I don't know that it absolutely has to be under stress for it to begin growing. Usually I see it on older specimens of black locust. So as they age, they might become more susceptible to the fungus.
Okay. Adam says, for the audience, can you go into more detail regarding Amanita Bisporgia poisoning? My
Oh,
bad
the Amanita,
enunciation.
the Amanita,
Yes.
the destroying angel. It's a pretty gory death from the destroying angel. Initially, after consumption, a short time afterwards, nausea will set in, but ultimately, it results in liver and kidney damage, and the individual dies of kidney and liver failure. There may be a period of time where the individual starts feeling better and then just crashes shortly thereafter. Remedy for it, there really isn't a remedy other than treating the symptoms. Survival rate depends on the dosage of the toxin consumed. Some have survived, but it is a fairly high mortality rate associated with the destroying angel.
Okay. Sandy says, we have a collection of some type of shelf fungus around a wound in a large tree. Does that mean the tree is dying? She says, it's a really nice picture. And would you like the picture?
You could send an image to me that I could potentially see if I could identify what shelf fungus might be associated with the tree. Does it immediately mean the tree is in danger? It all depends on the health of the tree to begin with and the species of tree. Some of our trees have a greater ability to compartmentalize decay, and so it can host a fungus, but the tree, such as some of our oak trees, can limit how much the fungus spreads within the tissues of the wood. And it'll depend on what species of fungus may be interacting with the tree. So there's a lot of ifs in that statement, but it is never a good sign to see shelf fungi growing on the trunk of a standing living tree. It means something is not right. How serious that is, that will be the job of a certified arborist to evaluate the condition of the tree.
Okay. James says, several years ago, I found a group of blue fungi that appeared to be growing out of the ground and were flat to the ground and quite large, about 12 inches in diameter. They were at McGee Marsh near Lake Erie. Any idea what they were?
There are mushrooms called bluets. No. I'll have to think of that one here for a second. There are distinctly some that have a beautiful, almost cobalt blue color to them. And it's not that I have found one myself, but I have seen them described in the field guides.
Okay.
I'll have to come back to that one.
Okay. Dean asks, are sheephead the same as chicken of the woods?
Yes, it is. Ram's head, sheep's head, hen of the woods.
Hen of the woods. So let's see. Eric was talking about how great the information was. You have recommended resources for macrofungi, which we've kind of talked about, but perhaps management for arborists.
Well, unfortunately, management is very, very limited. Management comes into play more from protecting the tree from ever getting infested in or infected in the first place. So good horticultural practices, good pruning practices, limiting pruning wounds as much as possible, limiting physical damage to the tree that could allow for the introduction of the fungus into the tree. But as far as eliminating or removing the fungus once it is established, it's next to impossible.
Okay. Laura asks, if you want to save your tree, should you remove the fungi to reduce the decay?
Unfortunately, when what you're seeing when you see the macrofungus, by which way identify it, all you are seeing is the reproductive portion of the fungus, which represents usually less than 5% of the overall body of the fungus. So removing the reproductive structure does little to nothing at controlling the fungus infection.
It's like out of sight, out of mind, Curtis. If you take the fungi off, it's not there anymore, right?
Yeah, well, at least the
in your
reproductive
mind.
part of it.
So Jim says, if I find fungi in my lawn, does that mean there's rotting wood somewhere underground?
Not necessarily. It just means that there's organic material available for decomposition. It doesn't necessarily have to be wood. It could simply be the roots of grasses, the leaf litter that's been incorporated into the soil by earthworms. If it is decomposable, whether it's leaf litter, wood, other organic organisms, a fungus will utilize it. So some of them are simply acquiring the organic material out of the soil.
Okay. So unfortunately, we had some ask for pictures to be shown, and we can't handle those at the moment. But Chad asks, did you talk about milk mushrooms?
Oh, the lacterium? No, I didn't get to any of the milky types of fungi, and they have a latex type of liquid that will be released when the fungus is damaged. And there's quite a few species that fall into that category. Some of the milks will be white, and sometimes they'll be cream colored, and other times they'll be orangish or pinkish in color. It all depends on the species. And they're actually fairly common.
Okay. So Teresa asks, what does a lack of fungi in the woods indicate?
Well, a lack of fungi could simply mean that they are there. They may be under environmental distress. In other words, it may just not be conducive for them to reach the reproductive stages. And some fungi can be present for years before they reach enough accumulation of organic material to stimulate them to go into their reproductive phase. So they're most likely there. They're just not producing the macrofungal reproductive structure that tells us that they are there.
Okay. Janelle asks, why do some mushrooms grow in ring clusters?
Oh, that's an interesting tale in itself. When the spore for that initiated that fungus landed in whatever environment that it was going to grow in, it starts growing as just a spot. But as time goes on and that fungus consumes the nutrients available in the spot, it will start growing outwards in a ring. And each year that ring will stretch further and further outwards. So what once was just a spot in a grassy area, and 10 years time or more, it might be several feet in diameter in a ring. So it's just the progressive consumption of the organic material available from the initial point where the fungal spore landed in the environment.
Okay. Matthew says toxicity of some of the native psychoactive fungi can be absorbed through the skin. Kind of follow up on that discussion we had.
Okay.
Anonymous says, does purchasing spores to plant certain types of edible mushrooms like morels work in the woods or home setting?
I'm not sure that there have been many that have been successful in propagating morels in a garden type of indoor growth. Seeding an area with morel spores, if the right environment is available, they may take hold. Often they are associated with different species of trees, such as old apple orchards. They seem to be a favored spot for morel hunters. In woodlots, they've been associated with elm trees. So not that I've been successful at following up on either one of those, but I don't know of anybody commercially producing morels in an enclosed environment like you can with some of the shiitake mushrooms and the oyster mushrooms, etc. They're a little bit finicky.
Yeah, years ago, there was a place in Fredericktown that tried. I mean, they gave it their best shot, and they weren't at it very long, and just didn't have any great success. That's the only one I'm aware of that tried to do the morel indoor thing. So
yeah, but there's lots of places that grow a lot of the edible mushrooms, like I listed there already, but I just have not heard of anybody successfully doing morels.
no, the elusive morel. John asks, how many different fungi grow in fairy rings?
Oh, quite a few. The Agaricus mushrooms, there are a multitude of species that will grow in fairy rings. There are puffballs that grow in fairy rings. There is the fairy ring mushroom, which is a small, delicate mushroom. There are, let's see, it's slipping my, unfortunately, there are also some of the lepiota mushrooms, such as the green spored parasol mushroom that grows in a fairy ring. And so just because it's a mushroom that grows in a fairy ring doesn't mean it's going to be an edible one.
Right. Matthew adds specifically dead decomposing elm with respect to morels. I remember as a kid here on the farm, our best spot was in the old orchard that was decaying. That's kind of where we started our morel hunt.
Yep.
But yeah, I have more luck with the dead and dying elm trees.
Yep.
When I have luck. So well, you saw, I think I sent you the picture of the one I got this spring, and that's the first one I've had in quite a while.
Yeah.
So they are elusive unless you're a really good hunter. And for me, it's about adjusting my eye. Once I find the first one, I can then find more. But that first one, spring, is like just crazy.
It's training the mind's eye to pick up on it.
Right.
And
So
mine's
Stephen,
blind.
So Steven says, in a yard, once a fungus consumes all the decomposable organic material, assuming more organic material is not added to the top of the yard, does it make that area in the yard less susceptible to fungi in the future?
Now, eventually, just mowing grass or just having grass growing in the lawn area is constantly adding additional organic material back into the soil. Yeah, and so to completely deplete the organic material from the yard, nothing would be growing in it after that. So I don't think that's a solution to removing fungi from a yard. And there are going to be different species that will have lesser requirements for the amount that's present.
Okay,
Hey,
well,
there
that
were
was our last question.
Well, there were a few in the chat, and I apologize if you asked them already, but we had one from Erin that says, can spores be toxic to inhale? And she's referencing the destroying angel.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that the spore is going to have a toxic chemical associated with it, as much as just breathing any kind of dust into the lungs is not advisable. Just mold spores in the air, that's one of the measurements that meteorologists do on a regular basis for reporting air quality. There's always concern about mold, black mold in houses, and smelling of the mold. Part of the potential danger to health is just breathing the spores in and the irritation that they could generate inside of the lungs and the tissues of the lungs. I wouldn't say that just being around the mushroom would be enough outdoors to cause problems, and unless, like I was as a kid, you played with the puffballs and had smoke of the spores flying all over the place. Some people will be more sensitive to that than others. And the more times one is exposed to large quantities, the greater the potential for negative interaction.
Okay.
Speaking of puffballs, the last question I came across in the chat is from Janet, and she's asking if they're edible.
Many of the puffballs are edible when they're very young, and all of the tissues on the interior are pure white. So the giant puffball tends to be one that people collect on a regular basis, as long as it's white through and through.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Curtis, for an amazing presentation, even
Thank
though
you
we
so
had
much.
technical glitches.
Yeah.
Hey, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have Marnie.
It
Go
seems
ahead.
like our internet connections are getting worse and